having just become a government employee again, and I enjoyed the rather minimal paperwork involved, you know, I found out there's even a form to get your comments on how well the Paperwork Reduction Act is working. But there is a benefit of being a new employee for a while, at least, maybe a few days. I can claim ignorance and seek forgiveness rather than permission for anything I have to say. Now, I will point out that about a year and a half ago, I gave a lunch talk at a final part of a conference at MIT, and my new boss, the NASA administrator, has not forgotten what I said then, so I'll do my best to hope he doesn't have anything today, but you never know. What I really like to talk about today is kind of the general theme here of the private sector in space exploration. When President Bush announced his new vision for space exploration a little over 2 years ago, a lot of us were pretty thrilled. And although I must say it, to me, it kind of felt a little bit like the Yogi Berra's famous "it's deja vu all over again" comment. Since I participated in the first President Bush's space exploration initiative, you know, again, giving away my advanced age here. But then as now, the space community got pretty excited and then frustrated. Now, I am confident, though, that we're off to a much better start today than in 1989. And I want to say largely due to the enthusiasm and leadership shown at NASA over the last year. Now, this having been said, though, you only have to open an issue of the Washington Post or the New York Times or some other paper that Dana Rohrabacher doesn't read and see some carping about exploration. It's too expensive, it competes with science, other priorities, etc. Now, this is kind of worrisome because although we have a supportive administration, Congress, and NASA leadership today, it's going to take a couple decades for us to realize the real objective of expanding human presence into the solar system. And I don't know how we're going to create this supportive, or it's very difficult to create the supportive situation we have today. And I'd like to say that when I talk about human presence, I really mean settlement of the solar system. And I want to... I'll probably be counseled on using that word, but I'm going to use it. Because that's what we're really embarking on. And that's the really exciting part of what we're about. Now, these are the key questions. You know, how do we sustain the vision for space exploration to lead us to settlement? How do we afford it? And how do we nurture it? Now, my answer, and I think a lot of yours, is the private sector. Now, this is not necessarily easy or straightforward. For a start, why would a private sector individual spend the money on space exploration? And if they do, what's the role of the government? And in particular, how do we address the number one item of all space activities? How do you get to space affordably to start with? Now, some, and many in this room, I'm sure, believe that the key to private sector funding of space activities starting with launch vehicles is space tourism. Indeed, most of the private sector space ventures ongoing today, such as Virgin Galactic and Bob Bigelow's Bigelow Aerospace, are focused on tourism. I do not doubt that tourism has a big role to play, especially in the space launch area. Indeed, I have to tell you that if the price comes down a little bit and I can figure out how to obfuscate my wife into where $100 grand or so of our savings went, and why I was gone for a week, I would love to fly into space myself. But I got to point out that history teaches that new frontiers were not opened up by tourists. English visitors and colonists in the 17th century had few, if any, wealthy tourists among their numbers. You know, and so I believe we have to look elsewhere for the interest and funds to sustain the type of space exploration and settlement that we all seek. Now, let me give you a few thoughts on this. And first, that I will assert, which may be changed by my leadership, but I will assert that the government should focus in two areas. The first is infrastructure. Now, having worked for a different organization, as Lou pointed out, that they used to call them roads and commodes. And now I'm an astronomer by background. In fact, until a week ago, I actually worked as an astronomer and was paid as an astronomer. It's always nice to receive a paycheck to do something that's really fun, which I am again, by the way. But I want to note that most of the light collecting power of this nation, and indeed of the world, has been and continues to be built largely with private non-federal funds. Now, it's relatively easy, although not simple, to ask a billionaire to spring for the world's largest telescope named after him, a move that will enshrine his or her name forever associated with unlocking the secrets of the universe. But it's quite another to ask this billionaire to spring for the Billionaire Smith Memorial Power Plant in dirt road leading to the observatory. Fortunately, we have a government that does that. Indeed, as I'll discuss later, I believe key space science, particularly space astronomy, might be done with privately funded space and lunar observatories. Now, second, private funding sources are not very interested in getting stuck with open-ended research and development. And this is, again, where I think the government comes in. And it indeed was the role of NASA's predecessor agency, NACA. Something I think that we could profitably learn. In fact, I was delighted when I got to Ames that all over the place are NACA logos. So I hope maybe we can stick one on a lunar probe here. But I might add that the key technology that I think we ought to pursue as the government is to pursue how to build robots that build robots. Indeed, the vision that I would have for the human space flight to the moon is that the next set of astronauts to land on the moon, we met at the door of a robot-built habitat by a robot offering a martini made from lunar resources. Although now that I live in California, some fine wine made from properly grown grapes. Let me talk about launch for a minute. This is a key area for private sector business in really the classic sense. And I believe that access to space should be treated as a private trucking company venture. And I'm really pleased to see that my agency has strongly supported this approach for resupply to the space station, and I think an area that could be very profitably advanced. Now let me turn to the moon for a minute. And there is a legitimate question to say, why would the private sector place money there? And I think there is a good answer. Now, I asked Edward Teller this question over a decade ago, and you probably remember him, a guy with a foreign accent and a striking resemblance to either Yoda or Dr. Strangelove, depending on the politics. Dr. Teller told me that he thought the best resource the moon had was space. And, I thought that was a smart aleck answer, but he went on to say that it was space where you could pretty much do as you like. In short, the moon doesn't have an environmental protection agency or any other regulatory agencies, and damn few lawyers, as far as I can tell. So I would maintain as something to look at is the moon could serve as a reserve for doing things that are too dangerous to do on the Earth, but that might have an earth-shaking benefit, if you'll pardon that pun. For example, I think the moon might be the key to mitigating global warming, in deference to Congressman Rohrabacher, if it exists. But this is another idea that Teller and his colleagues pioneered. Now, I have to be careful. It's a legitimate argument. My center will be happy to accept money to investigate this in detail. But this was an idea that Teller and his colleagues had, and I'll talk about it here a little more later. But let me start with infrastructure. For the moon, this means such things as communications, position, navigation, and timing, situation awareness, and power. There are two models for supplying these utilities. The first is a government model, currently popular. In the case, the government builds the utility and operates it. And the Global Positioning System is an example of that. But there's another approach to supplying infrastructure. This was the one used in building the transcontinental railroads in the 19th century. In this instance, the private sector was induced to build the railroads in return for two things. First, it was business by the government, but more important, it was land. The railroads were given ownership to land on either side of the railroad. This became their true inducement. And I certainly prefer this latter approach, but it's contingent upon a concept of private ownership of real estate on the moon. Now, this is arguably possible within the Outer Space Treaty, which seems to only prohibit national ownership. Now, it'll certainly be argued by far more lawyers than I ever care to deal with, but I guess that's not very many, since one is usually too many for me. But I want to make this point that the issue of private ownership, or at least the equivalent of it, is going to be a critical issue for not only the United States, but our partners around the world to resolve. Now, how might we start with the development of these lunar utilities? I'd suggest the first step should be just setting standards. Now, a couple of years ago, I read the story of two French astronomers in the late 18th century, and I'm sure I won't do justice to their names, but Jean-Baptiste Delhomme and Pierre Marchand. Now, French measurement systems at this time were a confusing mess in France, or just about any place else for that matter. For example, just what does furlongs per fortnight measure? Now, the French king commissioned these two astronomers to establish a standard unit of length that anyone could verify. And so they suggested that the meter was to be 1/10 millionth of a quadrant of the Earth's circumference. The astronomers were to measure this quadrant using survey instruments that were getting precise enough to measure a portion of this arc. Well, this was only supposed to take a year or so. At that time in history, the early 1790s, there was a bit of political turmoil, and their sponsor, the king, got a very close shave during that period. And for a while, careful what you sponsor, right? And for a while, Professor Marchand was actually behind enemy lines, and he was at some risk taking these measurements because he was using as a baseline an enemy fortress. And the Spanish authorities were a little concerned about a Frenchman measuring their fortress with the precise instrumentation. Now, in fact, the French astronomers made a big mistake and got the Earth's circumference slightly wrong. Now, as an American, it's always good to say something nasty about the French. I said, of course they do, they were French. But a little while, I'm in trouble for that, I guess. But a little while later, another French leader, Napoleon, used their measurements, and he called a world conference to set the meter's length. Now, everyone but the Brits showed up to this conference for some reason. I can't understand why they didn't show up, but
bad about the Brits.
I said about the bad about the Brits. They were busy at the time, drinking rum and never mind. But the interesting thing about this is this action set up a rational measurement system that put the French really in a very good situation for several centuries of industrial and scientific leadership. So I would maintain that a step that we can do right now in space exploration would be to emulate the French and set up protocols and standards in cooperation with our colleagues around the world that would be used for the moon and beyond. And this is something I would advocate to happen immediately. It doesn't cost any money. And it can really be something that's truly international. Now, we have an excellent opportunity to start by sending standards by communications protocols. And for example, in the next half-decade, at least 4 missions from a variety of nations are going to the moon. Our Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the Indian Chandrayaan-1, Chinese Chang'e, and the Japanese Selene, and there are others planned. I think now is the time to standardize the communications protocols and make these and all subsequent missions interoperable, a key requirement for private sector development. From this point, I believe some business case, perhaps encouraged by private ownership or usage agreements for lunar real estate, could finance and build much of the necessary infrastructure for long-range lunar development. The next step is to get the private sector to place the lunar communications and navigation and timing systems in place. If the government were to prove the technology out, and I believe we should do that for small satellites around the moon, and watch this place, in particular my new center, because I think we're going to try to do something along this line. I'm convinced the private sector will do the rest. For example, I believe NASA and other governments could agree to be what's called anchor tenants for a lunar communication systems which would be privately financed and put in place. Now, there's a word here I need to take what I mean by cheap. I don't see any reason why a few 100-kilogram lunar communications of a GPS-like satellite can't be built and launched for a few tens of millions of dollars. And I really mean this and hope to be able to prove it in a couple years. Now, what would the private sector want the moon for beyond support to government space activities? Let me suggest as a start privately funded science. As I noted, astronomy is a major privately financed science area in the U.S., at least for building big instruments. Some of these are pretty expensive. The Allen Radio Astronomy Array is over $30 million. The University of California's Keck Telescope cost over $100 million. The University of Arizona has got a large binocular telescope of similar cost. And the next generation of telescopes also plan to be privately financed or even more ambitious. The Giant Magellan Telescope, with its first mirrors now being polished at the University of Arizona, it will have an effective aperture of 24 meters and cost about $400 million. The University of California is beginning a 30-meter instrument that would cost up to $1 billion. Now, I would suggest, and I know that there are people here working on this, that why not put the follow-on instruments on the moon and privately fund them? Indeed, this is exactly what the Lunar Enterprise Corporation and Space Dev have in mind. An astronomy enthusiast in Hawaii who's here, Steve Durst, is working with Space Dev on a low-cost mission. I hope you've heard about that during the conference. Now, of course, there are issues with this approach. Among others, some of my astronomy colleagues point out there may be a dusty atmosphere over some areas of the moon. But just like terrestrial observatories, we need to do a site survey. And I believe that such a site survey can be done with a very low-cost lunar lander, considerably under $50 million. Now, this site survey does strike me as an appropriate government task, and I intend to urge NASA to consider such a mission. I want to point out I'm just a center director. I don't control the money. I'm allowed to propose things, and others dispose of them. However, there's a lot of ways to influence that. None of this makes anyone any money, however. And to be sure that I think what I'm calling venture philanthropists may fund lunar and Mars missions in the interest of mankind, but in the end, somebody needs to make money. And I think I might know, as I mentioned before, ways to do that. Let me follow up on Edward Teller's suggestion the moon is a place to perform dangerous technology development. He had in mind nuclear technologies, or nuclear, as certain leaders say. No doubt only in Congress. But there's far more dangerous technologies now under development. I've already noted robots that build robots. Some fear that such technology could get out of hand and turn the entire Earth into something called gray goo, consisting of trillions of self-replicating microbots that consume all the material on Earth. Now, the same technology could also, properly controlled, cheaply manufacture all humankind's need. But the scary and risky aspect of this may prevent us from even moving in these directions on Earth. But why not the moon? Development of this technology could proceed to the point on the moon where we had a high certainty that there's no gray goo problem or any other catastrophic potential, and high probability, not zero probability of the problem. I know better than to say that anything's perfect. But while no technology is completely safe, the extra layer of protection afforded by remote development could allow these high potential and high potential payoff for commercial investment approaches to proceed. Now, there are other dangerous and potentially high payoff, high risk technologies. Advanced genetic engineering and true artificial intelligence come to mind. The latter may present a particular sticky problem, as machine intelligence might be expected to operate and even evolve up to 1 million times faster than we do. In this case, any development of this technology would almost certainly be mandated to occur far away and under careful control. The moon could also be ideal for this. Other even more exotic possibilities may arise, such as experiments into so-called zero-point energy. The latter, and probably much of what I've discussed, is clearly the province of science fiction, but perhaps not forever. Each of these offers an unlimited future, with corresponding rewards for those investing in the development and production. But each have risk and may well mandate the extreme isolation of the moon. Perhaps the nearest term use of the moon to quarantine dangerous technologies may be the return of possibly life-bearing Martian material. With growing evidence in the form of variable methane and formaldehyde concentrations on Mars, the likelihood that either human expeditions to Mars or even returns of Mars samples will be forbidden until they can be determined to be safe or bearing Mars life is probably going to be mandated. Now, I understand from biological experts that our experience with mixing vastly different life forms is that one usually destroys the other. But the benefit to knowledge and even products of Martian life, if it exists, are awesome. But I wouldn't want to be the one that takes that 50-50 chance that we're on the losing side of that life discussion. So correspondingly, I think that building a Mars habitat and receiving a laboratory on the moon for Mars samples could allow us to determine the safety and perhaps compatibility with Earth life. Several investigators, such as Paul Todd, have designed simple and affordable Mars habitats for the moon that could perform this function. Given the benefits, I would suspect these facilities might even be funded from private sources. Again, one of the key aspects of the use of the moon as a quarantine lab for private product development is the issue of ownership. No one will invest in expensive facilities unless they have some confidence in continued use akin to ownership. As noted earlier, I believe the Outer Space Treaty arguably allows private non-government ownership. And again, it's essential that we address this issue soon if we're intending to have some sort of private investment. Now, if private ownership is set, I suspect there'll be a land rush for what may be the most valuable resource in the solar system, and that's namely the lunar polar craters with potentially volatiles, including water. But equally valuable, as many of you probably heard during this conference, are the nearby crater rims in near continuous sunlight, the so-called peaks of eternal light. Now, if this wasn't a space enthusiast community, I'd say you should call your real estate agents now. So after I get fired from Ames, I'll probably open a lunar real estate office. Careful. Now let me close my discussion of future possibilities with a rather encompassing idea. Global warming is a pretty big deal, as I'm sure you're all aware. Damage caused by global warming could run into tens of trillions of dollars over the next half century. And most solutions to this purported global warming, and again, I want to mention that there are those that don't believe there's global. No, I mean, it is an open and scientific issue of how much global warming and what the cause of it is. But I think that the bulk of scientific opinion is that there's a serious problem here. But most of the solutions I've heard of fall either into what I call the grow strawberries in the backyard school, or alternatively the complete restructure of the economy to use alternate fuels and so forth. Now, I think there's a third way on this, and I'm sort of, this came from a few years ago. There was an episode of Star Trek, and I'm sure no one here ever watched that. But it featured a super powerful creature called Q. I'm sure nobody knows who he was either. Now, he was on the Starship Enterprise when something called a giant stellar fragment, whatever that was about to destroy the ship. And I think it was Captain Picard, or it might have been Kirk, I can't remember. Asked him what he was going to do. He said it was simple, just change the gravitational constant. Now, I and one of my former colleagues at the University of Arizona, Professor Roger Angel, believe we can do the same for global warming. So you can say that they put Q in charge of NASA Ames. But in this case, we want to do something simpler. We just want to change the solar constant to compensate for greenhouse warming. And how do you think we might do that? Now, Edward Teller and his colleagues, particularly one of his colleagues named Jim Early, had an answer. They said to build a giant shield 2,000 kilometers across at the Earth's sun at one point to block a few percent of the solar input. Now, this would be obviously an impossible task if launched with current technology from the Earth. But it might be quite feasible if the material was obtained and launched from the moon. Or, alternatively, if there are new launch technologies, could make it even more affordable to launch from the Earth. Now, Roger and Angel and I have expanded on this previous work. And we believe that making the shields out of a transmissive material and using many smaller shields rather than a single large one would enable us to piecewise construct an affordable shield. Now, this is still a massive undertaking, obviously, of requiring 10 to 20 million tons of material or more at L1 and millions of small blocker spacecraft. Before you laugh too much, this amount of material is comparable to about 30 supertankers we build today to supply our energy needs. The technology to build the spaceship or the spacecraft easily exists today. Each spacecraft would consist of thin, lightweight struts, small solar sail positioners, and electronic control, as well as very thin glass diffusive elements that would be rolled out on the struts by robotic factories. Much of this material might be manufactured on the moon. Now, it's a daunting manufacturing task. Millions of units would have to be constructed over several decades. But small numbers of factories today produce millions of cars, weighing more than each of these spacecraft do each year. To get to the main point of our proposal, however, we believe such shield might be privately financed. Today, nations and individuals trade in carbon credits as part of the Kyoto Treaty's paradigm to limit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The going rate of these carbon credits is a few dollars to a few tens of dollars. I think it's actually euros, because the U.S. didn't sign the treaty. per ton of carbon. Now, there's about a 500 billion tons of excess carbon in the atmosphere, if you believe the numbers. So that's worth at least several $1 trillion to mitigate. And we'd suggest that the carbon credits might be sold to finance the construction of the shield, element by element. Indeed, if other methods to mitigate the shield are more effective, like carbon sequestration and so forth, then they would win out. Or it may be that all of them are more effective in concert. So even a partially constructed shield would contribute to the solution. Similarly, if it's no longer needed or counterproductive, or it turns out global warming doesn't exist, it's easy to sail the elements away in the solar system and out of the way. Now, while much of what I discussed here borders on science fiction, particularly the last proposal, I believe we should look into various private sector possibilities as the best and perhaps the only way to sustain the current vision for space exploration. And I look forward to your help in this in the years ahead. Thank you.